Welcome to the Choralosophy Podcast, Episode 17, Beyond Elijah Rock with Dr. Marques Garrett. In this episode, Marques and I discuss the importance of the music of black composers that do not fit into the categories of idiomatically black music, like gospel, jazz, and spirituals. The conversation ranges from the social aspects at play in spreading the word about this music, all the way to what it's like to be a minority seeking to be seen. Since composers like Nathaniel Dett, Samuel Coleridge-Taylor, and others are gone, Dr. Garrett is fighting for their music to be seen and heard. Before we get started, I have to tell you about our newest affiliate on the show. GraphitePublishing.com is on board as a sponsor of this program now, and I could not be more excited about this partnership. The opportunities that we have as choral directors to make decisions on the fly as to our programming is being helped more and more by technology. And as you know, online publishing is becoming more and more of a thing, which is attracting more and more top-name composers to websites like GraphitePublishing.com. So as school is starting and you have possibly procrastinated in programming like I have and not gotten all the pieces that you need, one great way to do that as the students are starting to come back to your choirs, rather than waiting 2 weeks for a piece to arrive, head over to GraphitePublishing.com and check out music by Jocelyn Hagan, Tim Takash, Eric Barnum, many more. And you can have it today. And of course, you can also, as a listener to this show, get it at a discount. Choralosophy at checkout gets you 10% off. So head over to GraphitePublishing.com and grab some scores for your school year. And as always, SightReadingFactory.com is another excellent resource that Choralosophy listeners can get at a discount by using Choralosophy at checkout. You can get your teacher membership discounted by 10%. By using that at checkout, but you can also get 10% off your whole order if you add memberships very reasonably for a few dollars a piece to your membership so that your students can practice unlimited exercises at home. And you can get 10% off of all of that, which is great as we try to squeeze blood out of an orange, so to speak, with our tight public school budgets or collegiate budgets. So head over to SightReadingFactory.com as well and enter Choralosophy at checkout to get 10% off. So without any further ado, here is my conversation with Dr. Marques Garrett. Okay, I'm here with Marques Garrett. Marques is a choral director at the University of Nebraska, and I came across Marques in person for the first time recently at a choral convention where I saw an awesome presentation that as soon as the presentation started, I thought, this is a podcast episode. I would love to dive more deeply into this topic. The topic was essentially, and I'll let him tell you more about it, but non-idiomatic black composers. And I found that idea fascinating. And so I'm going to just go ahead and turn it over to Marques to tell us more about him, and then we'll dive into the topic in just a little bit.
Okay, well, thank you for having me on here. I've seen a few other folks that you've had, and I'm honored to be able to talk about this. But a little bit about myself. And I tell everybody that, music has always been a part of me. I came out of the womb singing instead of crying. But I never knew that classical music really was a thing because I didn't grow up with that. Did music in the church, like contemporary Christian and gospel was pretty much it. My parents are not musically inclined, even though they like music. But it wasn't until undergrad where I really said, okay, yeah, this really is what's for me. And I went to Hampton University in Virginia, which is a historically black college. And it was there that I learned about all of these black composers. And did my bachelor's there, finished 2006, took a little time off and went to the University of North Carolina, Greensboro to do a master's in conducting, taught for 5 years at a school up in Pennsylvania. And then I went to Florida State to do a PhD in music education and choral conducting, and just finished my first year teaching at UNL.
Okay, well, welcome. The next thing I think we should probably do, just because most of the people who listen to this episode wouldn't have had the fortune to be at the presentation you gave at the convention in Missouri recently. So why don't you do the best you can to kind of recap what it was that you told us about in that room, without, of course, going into all the details. And I was actually thinking, too, that it might be nice if you're willing to share the PowerPoint with me, and I could put it in the show notes so that people, if they do become interested in this topic after hearing you talk about it, can see some of the names and dates and some of the things that we saw?
I think what might even be great is for me to I can just give the repertoire list that I have, and so they can actually just like go and find that music. But I can add a few other things to that as well because like the last page has some composer websites, and I put a few quotes about some of important of the more important folks that I've come across over the last 20 years or so, that kind of stuff. But yeah,
Okay.
I'd love to share that.
That's great. That's perfect. So let's start
Yeah.
with this. What is non-idiomatic Black composers' music? How would you define that?
So I always start with saying what is idiomatic. So idiomatic is
Right.
anything that is familiar to a particular group. When we are thinking of Black composers, typically, if you think, okay, if I'm going to do Black composers, a lot of people think February. Okay, that's fine. Black History Month, do Black composers, great. But most people go towards spirituals, gospel, and jazz because I was like, those are contributions, wonderful contributions. Unfortunately, that's pretty much all that people know about Black composers. So the non-idiomatic is going to be music that is in the Western European art form that is not strictly a spiritual, a jazz piece or a gospel piece. Now, some pieces do have the influence of those. If you think of our Nathaniel Dett and his most famous piece, Listen to the Lambs, which often gets miscategorized as a spiritual arrangement, but he literally only takes two measures of that spiritual and creates an anthem. It's an ABA form. The B section uses text from Isaiah. He shall feed his flock like a shepherd. Not a spiritual melody in any way, shape, form, or fashion. But sometimes that happens. So you have some of those pieces, or you have some composers who just grew up in jazz. And so, the same way that William Walton used jazz, or Poulenc even, they have jazz influences in their music, but we wouldn't say that those pieces are jazz like we would say for, Duke Ellington.
Right.
You know, somebody that everybody would know. So, yeah.
Okay. So in your view, then, what is there something in the music itself that how would you describe what might exist in the music itself that would make something idiomatically Black music? What would be some musical elements that would have to be present?
So that is a tricky topic because there's an article, a set of interviews that I believe David Baker did some years ago, where he interviewed several composers, and one that he interviewed was Undine Smith Moore. And a question that he asked many people was, "What is Black music?" Her response is, "Anything that a Black composer writes is Black music." So that's one person's take on it. For me, it really is just those things that we know are the art forms that were created by Black people. Like there's no disputing that. So we talk about spirituals and the fact that you had those displaced Africans, and without being able to learn how to read and write English, they then came up with well over, I believe it's like 6,000 spirituals, and we only hear about 25 of them. But there are a ton of spirituals or work songs that were created by them. If you continue on with the history of Black music, you then have gospel music, which started out with Black hymnody, which was really a combination of like hymns, spiritual, and then the jazz and blues that the musicians, the instrumentalists would be playing on Saturday night. And then they would just come in on Sunday morning, kind of play the same stuff. But instead of saying, as one of my mentors says, instead of saying baby, 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 it's now Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. So you have that. So yeah, I mean, those are the things that I would consider to be Black. I know that there are some folks who have a different take on it. And I say, it's music. So we all get to have our own viewpoints, not necessarily to say that one person is 100% right and the other person is 100% wrong. But for me, as a budding researcher, as long as you can justify it with a few facts, then I say, I'll go with it.
Okay, yeah. So I want to dive into that a little bit deeper, if that's okay. My brain is super analytical, and so as soon as I hear, like, I don't think you named specifically the person who said any music written by a Black person is Black music. but I would hear a statement like that, and I hear that as an absolute, and I don't like absolutes.
Right.
So I would start to look for exceptions.
Yeah.
And because all you have to do is find one exception to prove an absolute wrong. And so my thought would be like, if you're going to use kind of work songs and hymnody and spirituals, and put that in that idiom, wouldn't that have to be specific to the American Black experience? Because that's quite different than people from around the world and their indigenous.
Very true. That is very true. And that's one of the reasons why there are so many people who have been trying to navigate, especially in the current climate in 2019, with the fact that being in the United States, we have people from all over the world.
Right.
Just because you can look at somebody, they may look a certain way, but you don't know exactly where they're from without them opening their mouth.
Mhm.
So they could have skin that's pretty close to mine or darker, and they could have been born here where they trace all of their roots to the United States. They could be someone who just moved from England just 2 weeks ago, somebody who could be from South Africa or Nigeria. And so the term, I always use the phrase Black because there are two of my favorite composers were not born in the States. So our Nathaniel Dett was born in Ontario, and Samuel Coleridge-Taylor was born in England. So if I specifically talked about African American, then I would have to exclude them, and I would hate to do that because people need to be performing their music so much more, so much more.
Right.
Like Samuel Coleridge-Taylor, we'll be celebrating his 150th birthday in 6 years. So a lot of people need to be doing some Samuel Coleridge-Taylor when that comes around. And like our Nathaniel Dett's The Chariot Jubilee was published in 1919, but was premiered in 1920. So next year is going to be centennial since it was premiered. So I wouldn't be able to talk about them. So I guess those spiritual, gospel, and jazz are three of the genres that we are more familiar with. And I use those just because it would be difficult for me to then try. I'd have to do so much more teaching when it comes to what is Black and that kind of stuff. And since I know that most of the people who are viewing any of the presentations that I've done, who have conversations with me, are American, it's just easier to put it in that frame.
Okay, yeah. So I think if we're kind of zeroing in on better and better definitions of terms, then would it be fair to say, do you think that idiomatic, as you described it, idiomatic Black music being gospel, jazz, spirituals, that idiom though would only apply to the American experience?
Very true. Very true.
Okay.
So you can expand it to talk about the folk music as well. So spirituals are a specific type of folk music,
Right.
but we could expand that to the folk music of any other community that is part of the global Black experience.
Okay. So, because I think again, so here, just throwing out another example, if there is a particular tribal African culture that has its own music that arguably goes back thousands more years than the American, say, a spiritual would, that would be idiomatically Black as well.
Yeah.
But if you're using the word Black only to describe the appearance of the person,
Yeah.
right? But the music itself would have quite a bit of distinguishing features. They wouldn't. I think really that's what I'm trying to get like.
Yeah. So yeah, you're absolutely correct. So the term Black, I've chosen to use three specific examples, but those are not meant to be the end all be all of the conversation. So yes, there are other cultures that are encompassed in that, and I just use the ones that people are the most familiar with.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. And of course, I recognize that your audience is mostly American, and so we're gonna. I just yeah, like I said, that's just the way my brain works. Like whenever I dissect words, people who have listened to the show have already figured that out. Like it's just how I think. And the other reason that kind of made me start thinking about it was because, when I heard your topic, actually, before I even got there, my wheels were already spinning, of how that same way of thinking and parsing out, and highlighting, which I think I want to ask you about that in a second too, highlighting those composers. But that same line of thinking in my mind could be applied to music of almost any culture,
Oh,
in a sense that there is, and we had talked about this a little bit before your session started, where there was, um, you could name almost any culture, and if you go back far enough, there would be, in time, there would be some kind of indigenous folk, um, not classical in the way we think of it, where classical music is taught by teachers to students in a classroom or in a lesson, with rules, and and that kind of thing, but more passed down through the oral tradition and through grandma playing on your porch and while you listen growing up, and that kind of thing. And every culture has that, which
yeah,
I think is interesting. And for me, I became interested in your topic in that way because I I feel very protective of our kind of our classical art form as being by itself not attached to a race. Like, because I feel like it's
not officially, not
well,
officially.
no, I understand. I'll talk. I'll let you punch back at that. But I see it as not attached to a race because I see it as something that is accessible or can be or should be to everyone.
Yeah,
Whereas it would be very, very hard for me to ever really master or even understand indigenous Korean folk mountain music, right?
yeah,
I could listen to it, I could appreciate it, but I probably couldn't, like, it would take me a whole lifetime of immersion to really
hmm,
understand that music.
yeah,
Whereas classical music, anybody from anywhere, if you study the methods or the techniques with a good teacher, you can learn it and be really
yeah.
good at it. So that's the distinction for me.
Gotcha. I had an interesting conversation maybe 4 or 5 years ago with Jason Thompson, who teaches at Arizona State University. He was the multicultural R&R chair. I believe it was while he was out, when he first got to Arizona. And in an article that he wrote, he talked about expanding our concept of multiculturalism. Because when you look at a lot of multicultural lists of repertoire, it's typically always going to be the folk music. And so we then forget that, I mean, those cultures also make contributions to classical music, as we consider it to be, up here
Mhm.
and that kind of stuff, which it was there for the longest time until we had the multiculturalism rise in education and specifically music education. So that was one great thing, one great conversation that I had with him, just talking about how we can think broader. And so it goes back to when that choir director says, I'm going to do a Black History Month concert. All right, I'm going to do this, these Moses Hogan spirituals, these Stacey Gibbs spirituals. I'll do this Josephine Polinitz, City Called Heaven. I'll do this Keith Hampton gospel piece, this Jeff Ames gospel piece. And yeah, we're celebrating Black History Month. That's great. You're like, but there's so much more. My very first presentation on this topic was for Florida ACDA back in 2017, and a gentleman came up to me right before, and he said, "The only reason I'm at ACDA this time is because of your session." He said, "I'm planning a concert for February, and I looked at my list, and all I had was spirituals, gospel, and jazz." And he was like, "I don't know any other pieces." My first year at Florida State, I decided to look into just kind of where were people's thoughts when it comes to repertoire. So I reached out to 15 graduates of historically Black college choirs and 15 graduates from predominantly white institutions who had sung in choir. And overwhelmingly, the HBCU graduates, I think the question was something to the effect of, name your top 3 favorite pieces by a Black composer. The HBCU graduates probably a little more than twice as much listed original pieces by Black composers. And I said it has to do with the tradition of HBCU choirs. Roland Carter told me in an interview a couple years ago that one of the reasons why HBCU choirs performed the music more frequently than others was because we had the composers at our schools. Onion Smith Moore taught at Virginia State from, I think, 1927 to 1972 or something like that. And her colleague, later colleague, Carl Harris, would tell me stories about how she would finish a piece and they lived like a floor away from each other. So she'd come to his apartment and say, "Hey, Carl, look at this piece I just finished." And he performed a number of them. And Virginia State still performs that music. Hampton still performs the music of its composers. So when I was there, we did Nathan Carter, Roland Carter, Noah Ryder, and our Nathaniel Dett. Like we always had those. And in years since I've been gone, they've expanded that to some newer composers and that kind of stuff. But I think about Morehouse College and how they frequently, I mean, they will always have a piece by Wendell Whalum in their repertoire. Spelman College is always doing music of Kevin Johnson. Nathan Carter was at Morgan State, so they all frequently do his music, even though Adolphus Hailstork was at Norfolk State as composer in residence before he went to Old Dominion University. I mean, Norfolk State and Morgan State still frequently perform the music of Hailstork. So, I mean, those composers were there, and there have been plenty others, but for many of the conductors, it was, if we don't do our music, nobody else will. Because I have a friend who has a number of spiritual arrangements out, and they're very popular. I mean, Texas All State had even recently did one, and he submitted one of his original pieces, and they said, this is a nice piece, but we want another spiritual from you. And he said, I will not let you publish another piece of mine until you publish this original piece, because I'm not going to allow you to put forth that stereotype that all we can do is spirituals.
Right. Okay. So that piqued that little topic there you dived into with the HBCU and the history and the tradition there. That piqued a little interest in me with a kind of a dovetail. So stick with me.
Okay.
You feel free to smack this down if it's if it's wrong. But I know a little bit about the history and behind why the HBCUs originally started.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there was a philosophical underpinning there when most of those schools were starting, where obviously their students or their potential body of students was not being given access to the same type of classical education that white students of that era were given. And of course, when I use the term classical education, I don't mean Bach and Mozart. I mean classical education in the Socratic method, in the asking why, asking how, seeking truth, the kind of modernist way of Enlightenment era thinking was being that type of education at the university was being given to students that were white, and students that were Black were not having access to do that. And so I can't imagine that wouldn't also spill into the tradition of the music schools that were starting there, as saying, we're not going to create a school that this might sound crass, but I can't put it any better way. That I don't think they were trying to start a school that would be a good school for a Black school. Like they were trying to start a school that was as good or better as their white counterparts were starting. And it makes sense to me that you would have a choral tradition that would stem out of that mindset that was probably also present in the sciences, was also present in the literature departments and all of that. Do you think that's a fair look back to?
Oh, yeah. Okay. So there are at least two things I'll say, and I'll kind of work backwards. I have seen on social media, and I've had many conversations about this. Most Black people in the United States would say, without any hesitation, that we have been taught we have to always be 3 steps ahead. We have to be 300% better in order to get the same chances that someone else would have. So that kind of thing is very accurate. I mean, the HBCUs were started. The first was what is now Cheyney University of Pennsylvania. They were founded in 1837, And then 17 years later was Lincoln University. Both, weirdly enough, are the only two HBCUs in Pennsylvania. So the oldest two are in Pennsylvania. But all of these schools were started to educate freed slaves because there really weren't any schools that would let any of us in. So yes, they were started that way. And while I don't know of an HBCU that had a music department when they first started, from what I read, for the most part, they just had folks who just like to sing. So they would just sing. And then they would form, a choir. I mean, the Hampton Singers started a few years after Hampton was founded, but they used that model of the Fifth Jubilee Singers. We're going to have this group, we're going to go out and we'll tour, bring back money for our school. And like at Hampton, they teach us that the Hampton Singers literally sang up Virginia Hall, because they brought I don't know how much money it was, but it was a ton of money for that time. And that building was paid almost exclusively by those funds. But when you look back at the records from those tours, it was always interesting to see how they were enthusiastically welcomed in the concert hall, but almost every time they would then try to go get something to eat or get a hotel room or whatever, so many folks wouldn't let them stay there, and that kind of, they had so many issues to deal with. So I know when Dett started the music department at Hampton, he said, okay, I got this education from top-notch school, and I'm going to make sure that my students are prepared for that. So he said every student is going to do piano. Every student is going to be singing. And I mean, he had a full list of all of these things, and it took no time. I want to say it's in this book, Follow Me by Ann P. Simpson. She wrote the big book on Dett. She talks about how there was no grass grew under Dett's feet, because he was he was doing so much when he got to Hampton, because he said, I want to make sure that they are ready. And even when you look at the Tuskegee Choir under William Dawson, and even though the Hall Johnson Choir was not affiliated with the university, I would probably say I haven't read enough of the Hall Johnson biography yet to stay as unequivocally, but I'm pretty sure most of them were graduates of historically Black colleges. And people often talked about how they had the quietest of pianissimos and the loudest of fortes. The ranges of each individual voice was like astronomical. And if you look at some of the arrangements or the pieces that were written for those choirs, you're like, yeah, you look at Hall Johnson's music, a lot of his big stuff, you'll have all those high soprano descants, singing A flats, B flats, C's, and sometimes D's. And you're just like, who are these singers that they had where they could do all that? But then you could also look at Nathaniel Dett's music for women's choir. The bulk of it he wrote when he taught at Bennett College, which is an HBCU for women in Greensboro, North Carolina. And the alto two parts go down to low F, E flats. There's even at least one piece that has a low D for alto twos. And I'm just like, man, I wish I had women like that in my choir now. I mean, like, they are singing all this low stuff, but then the altos would still sing some of the high soprano parts. I know my friend Alex Favazza, who teaches at University of New Hampshire, he taught at Southwind. I'm pretty sure I'm saying this correctly. He'll correct me if I say it wrong, but he taught at Southwind in Memphis, and his school's predominantly Black. And he talked about how the girls in his choir, like, they all could sing soprano, but they also could all sing alto. Like, they're floating all the way up. And his boys, they could sing the lowest of lows, but then chest out high G's and A flats, like in gospel music. And it's just like, oh my gosh. So I don't know if part of that was like just they were born that way, or if they were taught that. I mean, I don't know, but I said all that to just say, yeah, we had to do quite a bit to be accepted and that kind of stuff. And so when it came for the music, I mean, I look at Undine Smith Moore's music, and I have a good amount of her music that was never even published. and looking at some of those pieces, and you're like, again, the ranges are quite extreme, and you're just like, wow, but she wrote it because there was a choir there that could perform it.
Right. So yeah, and I think that's interesting because it sounds like just from hearing you talk, especially about our Nathaniel Dett, that you've read quite a bit, not only about him but probably some of his own writings. Is that true? Did he write much?
Oh, oh, he wrote a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, whenever I talk about that, I talk about the fact that even though people knew him as a conductor and composer, and a good amount of people knew him as a pianist. I mean, because that's actually where he started.
Hmm.
And I hate to say this, but his piano music is so much better than his choral music. I mean, his choral music is great. And that's why I did my dissertation on his choral music, but I dedicated a chapter to what he wrote about Black music. So there is an encyclopedia article from like the late 30s. There's actually, I believe, one of my mentors is sending this to me because I've only seen it in a library. It's called the R. Nathaniel Dett Reader. And I can't remember who compiled it, but there were several articles that he wrote at the beginning of the religious folk songs of the Negro. He has a 7-section forward that talks about religious folk music. He also has the Dett collection of spirituals in 4 volumes, and there is a forward to each of those. The first one is untitled. Another one is the development of the spiritual, I think, and there's one that's like the development of Negro religious music. But yeah, I mean, there are at least 12 articles that I've seen. There are probably more, and I just can't think of them right now. But he wrote a ton about what it was like to be a Black musician during his time, and he referenced the composers who were also going against the grain. So like Samuel Coleridge-Taylor, who, I mean, you look at him and you know he's Black. I mean, he looks very Black. His skin is dark, but outside of his piano set, the 24 Negro Melodies, he took, I think it was 12 spirituals and then 12 folk songs from from West Africa and the Caribbean, and he wrote just piano pieces based on those. He'll have the tune at the top, and I mean, it's a wonderful set. But outside of that, everything else of his just sounds like something that was written late 1800s, early 1900s, that you would say maybe Elgar or Holst wrote it, that kind of stuff. And so Dett talked about how Samuel Coleridge-Taylor was one who was advancing the cause of, and I use this just because Dett said it this way, of Negro music. But he also talked about, William Dawson. He has his the Negro Folk Symphony. William Grant Still, was writing a ton of music. That's why he's called the Dean of African American Composers. And not all of his music has necessarily an idiomatic influence, that kind of stuff.
So do you think, based on your reading and understanding of those, I'll pick those 2 gentlemen as an example. So Coleridge-Taylor and Dett, that when they were writing something that based on your current definition would not be idiomatically Black music, do you think they thought of it that way? Like, here, I'm going to sit down and write like a white person song?
Okay, so I would say that,
or is that a modernization, like the way we think about race now?
I would say Coleridge-Taylor was just writing music.
Okay.
Because his father was Black, and if I remember correctly, he never met him.
Okay.
Yeah, his father had like moved back, or he only knew him when he was like really, really, really young. But his father moved back to Africa because he was a doctor, but wasn't able to get any patients because he was from Africa. Like, they just didn't want to have him as a doctor, so he moved back to Africa. But Coleridge-Taylor just wrote. I mean, he went to the Royal College of Music. Stanford was one of his teachers, so he was just writing music. Elgar was the one who said, hey, you should write for the Three Choirs Festival. Like, he recommended him. Mm-hmm. Now, Dett was specifically trying to write music that, for lack of a better phrase, sounded white. But he wanted to still use, as he said, the Negro folk music. Most of them were spirituals, but they all were not. His thing was that in the early 20th century, as Black Americans were being able to go to some white schools, he found that the more educated they were, the more they tried to distance themselves from anything that reminded them of slavery. And if you're thinking music, it would then be spirituals. So when they went to church, they wanted to just sing hymns and anthems like every other white person that was there. They felt that spirituals went along with a lot of the extemporaneous styles of music from those who were not as educated. So there are certain denominations that go that way, and there are other denominations that go more towards the anthems and hymns and that kind of stuff.
There was a certain amount of desire to assimilate.
Definitely. And so his thing was that spirituals or Negro folk music is too precious, too unique to us for us to say we don't want to have that anymore. He said, I mean, Dvorak talked about how if you're going to create an American sound, you need to go into the melodies of the Negro slave and the American Indian. Like that's how you're going to create your American sound. And so Dett said, all right, I will solve this peculiar problem by combining spirituals or folk music with anthems and motets. So one of his first pieces published was Listen to the Land. So like I said, he only took 2 measures from that spiritual. And you don't even know why they're crying or what they're crying. Because actually the spiritual said, listen to the lands, all are crying, I want to go to heaven when I die. He doesn't even use that part. It just says, listen to the lands. And then he pairs that with the scripture. He shall feed his flocks, lambs, sheep, all that kind of stuff, puts that together. So at least half of his music falls into that category of an anthem or a motet. Some of them he specifically stated that way. Let Us Cheer the Weary Traveler, he said, is in the style of a motet. He won I think it was the Francis Booth Prize from Harvard for something about a traveler. Don't Be Weary Traveler. So he wrote that as a motet for 6 unaccompanied voices. And he won. But when they found out that he was Black, they didn't split the prize with somebody else. But that's topic for another day. But yeah, I mean, he took that spiritual, don't be weary, traveler, come along home to Jesus, however it goes. And he created a motet out of that. There's a fugato that happens at the end. That's one of the things I love about Dett's music is that he was not scared to use a lot of those compositional techniques that you learn as a composer and use them with spirituals. So if you take The Ordering of Moses, his magnum opus, written as his thesis, he wrote that, it was premiered in 1937. And it's mostly based on Go Down Moses. And when he created a fugue on Go Down Moses. There aren't I don't know of a ton of composers. And if anybody wants to share with me, I will gladly receive. I don't know a ton of fugues that were based on spirituals.
One thing I think would be really cool, and anyone who's listening to this, you can make this official. I would commission, probably from my school, like if there could be, okay, so let me start it this way. So you know how back in the day, in polyphonic music of Europe would frequently, like a mass or a motet would be based on a folk song, a tune.
Yeah.
Why can't we have in 2019 a polyphonic mass based on a spiritual tune?
That was close to one of the ideas that I've had for the longest time. One thing that I like to do with spirituals is it kind of like Dett, but I guess it's just inspired by, is to see what else you can do with it. So I have maybe 3 or 4 spiritual arrangements. I use that term loosely, where I combine Latin text with spirituals. The easiest one to do was Lord Have Mercy. I actually got it from this book right here. And at the very end of it is the spiritual Lord Have Mercy. Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy. So if I'm going to put that to Latin, what Latin text am I going to use? Everybody's going to say Kyrie eleison. Great. So one day I was still in undergrad, and I remember I was just at the piano just playing something random. I don't need to play it. And I then said, oh, maybe I can mix that with that spiritual. And then, so what I did was the choir says Kyrie eleison for 2 verses, Christe eleison for 2 verses, and Kyrie eleison for 2 verses. That's what you're supposed to do with a mass. And then the soloist has the spiritual. So you literally have macaronic at the same time.
Right.
But there have been other things that I've done. Yeah. There's a what is it? Go Tell on the Mountain, where I started out with like Gloria in Excelsis Deo. I mean, just trying to find anywhere that I have an arrangement. We Shall Walk Through the Valley, a piece. We walk through the valley in peace, and I use Pacem, that kind of thing to infuse in that. So I mean, that's one thing that I tried to do, is to do that. But I have had the idea of creating a mass that is based on spirituals. Never was a polyphonic, but if somebody writes that, I mean, I'll be one of the first people to perform that. I mean, you got my word. I will do that. My chamber singers will be ready for it.
That would be
You just tell me when it's done, and I got it.
All right, that would be really cool. My other idea, my other idea was to have a polyphonic mass called Misa Jar Jar Binks, and it would be based on all the Star Wars themes. But maybe the other idea is better.
I also was thinking, I remember when I was in grad school and was learning about parody masses and all that kind of stuff, the first thing I said it to some of my classmates, what if we had like a Misa de Beyonce, where we use all Beyonce tunes, and that was a Cantus Firmus. And then like some years later, I then see that they're like some cathedral in California actually had a mass where they only used Beyonce songs, and like it brought a bunch of people in to church.
I'm sure.
Yeah. Hilarious, but yeah.
Okay, so that's great. I love this. This is fun. So back to your presentation. Let's kind of dive back in there.
Okay, yeah.
And I want to ask you, it sounds like we've already gotten some of this answer, but what originally inspired you to put together this topic? Why do you feel like this, being the evangelist of non-idiomatic Black composers, why does that fall to you? Where's your inspiration?
So when I was in grad school the first time, I shared a piece with a friend of mine, and it was a cantata by Hailstork. And after seeing Hailstork's picture, he was like, "Oh, I can't do that because it's not gospel." And I was like, "I didn't say this was gospel. Like, it's just a cantata. Like, anybody else could have written." And then just over the years, I have noticed that so many conductors, and especially students, just are not familiar with this. I had a friend who was working on his doctorate in music in his last semester, and said that he could not name a single art song or opera aria written by a Black composer. This is his third degree that he's working on, and had never experienced that. So what I found is that for those who are in graduate programs, if you get any time dedicated to Black composers, it's going to be a topic on spirituals. 1, maybe 2 days. Now, at UNL, our grad students have 4 semesters of choral lit. I teach those, and we do. This coming semester is going to be before 1600. Then we do 16 to 1750, 1750 to 1900, and then since 1900. Well, in the fall, I got to talk about Jose Mauricio Nunez Garcia. We had a whole day, maybe a day and a half, just on him, because nobody knows that Afro-Brazilian. Not enough people know about that Afro-Brazilian composer. And then at the end of the semester, we talked about Samuel Coleridge-Taylor, Hiawatha's Wedding Feast. If you haven't heard it, like, just go to YouTube and listen to it. It's like 30 minutes. You can download the score from IMSLP. You got it right there. Have a listening party. But then when it came time for 20 and 21st century, we had 4.5 weeks on Black composers. I gave them a little preview, a little overview of spirituals, and then we dove into a bunch of composers. And then I did the flip side. Instead of doing spirituals, I did all the non-idiomatic. So we talked about cantatas, oratorios, psalm settings. Didn't really get into the masses, but that would have been fun to get into as well. And then I talked about the hybrids. So the ones who, like, Hailstork has a ton of choral music, and most of it does not have an idiomatic influence. He does have some spiritual arrangements, but 2 of his bigger works, I Will Lift Up Mine Eyes and Done Made My Vow, do have Black influence. I Will Lift Up Mine Eyes uses pentatonic melodies for almost all of the tenor solos in the first movement. There is you can hear some blues in the second movement. He calls for gospel improvisation for like 20 seconds. And then the last movement has the quasi-parallel motion that you would get in a lot of gospel music. So he uses that, but it's not a gospel piece, not a jazz piece. And then Done Made My Vow uses the spiritual Done Made My Vow as its theme at the beginning. He brings it back here and there, but it's an original piece.
So what would you say?
He was one of those hybrid folks. And then I talked about Dett, of course. We had a good talk about our Nathaniel Dett.
Right. So what would you say to the person? I'm going to play devil's advocate because this is not a question I would ask, I don't think. But what would you say to the person who would say that since these composers were writing white music, why do we need to know about them? Why shouldn't we just focus on the authentically Black music?
Because the composers still get stereotyped that way.
Right. And I've already made clear, I don't consider classical music to be a skin color. I think it's its own genre, that's its own thing. But I feel like there's a lot more and more over the last 10 years, this desire to keep cultures and their music and art separate. And
oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, like cultural appropriation is the term that comes to my mind. Is that's super hot right now, is to talk about which cultures are appropriating which cultures. And and I think about, like, I was when you were giving the session, I was trying to think about music that I would consider idiomatically white. And I immediately came up with cowboy songs, and I don't mean country music. I mean, like, the old cowboy songs. I went with my family this summer to a chuck wagon dinner out in Arizona in the desert. And and I'm sitting there looking around. It was actually about a week after your session. We went on vacation, and I was sitting there looking around going, okay, this is what white music is. This is the whitest music. Like, I could teach somebody with dark skin to play those songs. But it would be, but I also grew up going to those chuck wagon things with my grandparents. Like, I got it. Like, I understood the culture. Like, it was there. And whereas I could take maybe 1% of the people that were there at that thing and give them classical music lessons, and most of them would have no idea what they're like. They wouldn't know or care.
Right. Yeah.
And so to me, that's classical music for me is something that a very small sliver of the population of any skin color gets or cares about or understands. So I'm kind of against any kind of trying to divide up our tiny little culture that as I see it, I see classical music already as a tiny little subsection of people.
It is, unfortunately, because of people's ideas that certain people are better than others and certain things are only reserved for certain groups of people. It has been the trend for the longest time that white people have been in charge of classical music.
Mm-hmm.
I can't think of the name of the orchestra. It starts with like a CH, like maybe Chinike. But they are an all-Black orchestra that played at the BBC Proms just a couple years ago. And the orchestra was started because, that conductor and others said, I can look at an orchestra and too many times I'll never see anybody that looks like me. I've gone to many orchestral concerts where nobody looked like me.
Mm-hmm.
There may have been two people in the audience who looked like me. And so, unfortunately, if you don't see people who look like you may not be able to think that it's something that you can do. Case in point, when Jason Ferdinand was talking about his students and how so many of them, because they had not seen anybody doing what they now do,
mm-hmm.
it was almost like, this is not a possibility for me. And so it's one of the reasons why I say when people choose to teach this music to their students, or even when they're teaching their audiences, it's important for people to see what the composers look like, and not just the people that are not white, but show everybody so that folks know. whether it's something that they would expect or they wouldn't expect. I heard a story about Adolphus Hailstork being at a performance of one of his pieces, and it didn't sound black, so nobody was looking for a black guy to stand up.
Right.
I remember taking my black choir to a white church, and the woman saying, "Oh, I can't wait for y'all to do some of that rousing gospel music." And I'm like, I only taught my choir one gospel piece.
Mm-hmm.
And my students, there were a couple of them who had said early on, like, "Why don't you teach us more gospel?" And I'm like, y'all already do that stuff. The classical stuff is the stuff you don't know how to do. That's why I'm teaching you this. And that was stuff they loved more. Anyway, they were just curious as to why they didn't do it more. My students, like, they actually, within a year, they much more preferred the classical pieces. I had a student who, we didn't rehearse Randall Thompson's Alleluia for like 2 weeks, and he like almost had a heart attack because he just loved that piece so much. Mm-hmm. Another student who had only sung in her middle school choir, her favorite piece, her nickname was Giochila Femorigade, because she just loved that piece by Debussy. Like, every time we were around, she wanted to sing that. But unfortunately, even for them, for my students then, they didn't have anybody who did classical music, so they never saw it. Is classical music necessarily a white thing? A lot of people that I know would say that it still is, because there's still a lot of times where there just is not enough diversity and that kind of stuff, and it's just a historical thing. I mean, I don't think that I mean, what is white music in totality? Just like what is black music? You know, like when you mention cowboy music, we're thinking that's white American music,
right?
White folks, you know, in Ireland, they're not going to consider that.
Right. Well, and here's how I would push back on that then, is I would say that I absolutely agree with everything you just said about historical representation within classical music being primarily white. Absolutely. I'm not going to argue that. That would be very strange and difficult to argue with, actually. But so that's not my point. But what I would say is that is a criticism of the people that have orchestrated, no pun intended, the classical music over the time. The fault doesn't lie in the music itself.
That's very true.
Okay, so here, what I mean by that, what I mean by that is, let's not blame the music or the processes of learning the music that were necessary to have classical music exist. And like I said earlier, classical music, the way I think of it, is I tie the word classical to classical education, which is that you, in order to get good at it, you have to have a teacher-pupil interaction, and there has to be a technique, and there has to be it is a different function than folk or indigenous music styles, where the performance and the practice. So, for example, in a folk or indigenous style, the practice is the performance. In other words, you are practicing by performing all the time. There's little distinction. Whereas classical musicians practice 90% of the time and perform 10. To me, that's a very different way of thinking about music. I think Kentucky bluegrass, if you grow up hearing your grandma play it, you're not gonna take bluegrass lessons. You're just gonna pick it out until you get it, and eventually you're doing it all the time. So for me, that's where I meet the distinction. Is I say, yes, absolutely, you criticize the lack of representation in those idioms. However, I think we can do that. We can do that on one side, where we say, yeah, let's get more representation. Let's like you're doing. Let's teach more people about these composers, but let's not say that the music itself that they're writing has a race. It's like,
I can give it that. Yeah, I can definitely give that. I think it's just been easier for people to talk about people versus talking about the music. I mean, because I've had folks who were like, well, why would you teach about Black composers for so long? I mean, I say it's because I want to make sure that my students cannot say, well, we learned from this person and we didn't get enough other stuff. Now, I have no problem saying that, because this is my focus, because this is my area of research, because this is what I just love talking about, there are other things that I tend to leave out. But as one of my pastors taught me years ago, every battle can't be fought by every person.
No, no,
And so for me, my three goals are to make sure that my students have the tools that are necessary to go out and accomplish anything. So if they are in a choral lit class, that means knowing about a bunch of different composers. If they are in a conducting class with me, knowing that these you can conduct it this way, but you can also conduct this way. I'm not going to say you have to keep time with your right hand. If you're left-handed, keep time with your left hand. There ain't going to be a single person in your ensemble that's not going to be able to keep time with you. Which is one of the reasons why it's great that I team teach that class with Carolyn Barber. Because most times we agree, but there are times when we don't, and it's okay. We tell our students it's fine. It's not like neither one of us is wrong, but it's just, another thing to think about. And then with my ensembles, I want them to be independent musicians. I don't care how many years you've had studying, even just one semester with me. I want you to feel that you can make music without me telling you how to do every single thing. It should not be where you have to say, oh, well, Dr. Garrett said I have to do this. No, you just start doing it because you have learned. And so that's one thing. But I also want to I know that I can't teach everything. And there are too many graduate programs that don't have any talks about Black composers. Where because Black composers were not given the platform, people then say, oh, well, if people aren't performing it, it's because it wasn't good. No, people just wouldn't, because of racism, they wouldn't even listen to the piece. They wouldn't let people audition to be on this stage or that stage. There were tons of folks. I mean, Marian Anderson, not being able to perform because of race. The fact that we still have tons and tons of the first Black person to do this and that in 2019 is because there are still things that are happening. I said there were three things, and I forgot what the first two that I said, so I can't say what the third one is. But when it comes to this music, I talk about it because not enough people do. Do I think that there needs to be a Black composer on every concert? Nope. I'll never say that. But if you can go through a whole year having 4 concerts and you haven't put one on, unless you are only doing masterworks, then I'll give you a 5-year window. Because I got a ton of masterworks I can tell you about. You want some choral orchestral stuff? I can give it to you. My presentation at NCCO, since I'm going to be talking to collegiate students and collegiate directors, it's going to be focused then on the choral orchestral and the more advanced music. So we're going to be, we're going to hear some George Walker, some Ulysses K, some of the harder Undine Smith Moore pieces. But then the Hailstork, I mean, that's my guy right there. I love Hailstork after that. So I'm able to talk about those things there. Whereas for the ACDA presentations, I've been gearing those more towards the accessible music for middle school and high school students. So, if you don't have 8 parts in your choir, that's fine. Here's a 3-part piece you can do by Victor Johnson, and it's going to work just fine. Here's a 4-part piece by Derek Fox. It's going to work with little rehearsal time and that kind of stuff. So it's just really about making sure that people just think at some point in the near future, I want to make sure that my students or my ensemble members, my church choir members get this experience. I mean, I'm grateful for Tom Trenny at First Plymouth, and that I share a lot of stuff with him, and I don't expect him to perform half of the stuff. I just get excited about some stuff, and I'm blessed to be at a church that can do a lot of music and can do some hard music. And so this semester, we're doing the first movement of Hailstork's cantata. I get to conduct it the first time, and I'm a happy man.
That's awesome.
I am happy.
Yeah. See, I and for what it's worth, I think that kind of going back to something you said a few minutes ago, where some people have asked you, so why do you spend so much time talking in choral lit, for example, about Black composers? I think any good teacher teaches what they know about and what they're passionate about. So for what it's worth, I support you doing that, and I don't support you doing that because of the racial component, although that's valid also. I support it because it's what you love and it's what you're passionate about, and your students, they'll get more from that than they will from any, because, like you said it also earlier, you can't teach in a choral lit class everything.
Right.
You just can't. Yeah, and that's true of every teacher who chooses what to focus on. You're going to leave somebody out in the cold when you put together a choral lit. So teach the things that when you put them in front of your students, your eyes are going to light up, because then they're going to be seeing that that's what choral music is for them. And there's a certain amount of, like, I'm sure there's choral music where if I was teaching a choral lit class that I wouldn't feel super qualified to talk in depth about. And so I might not choose to put as much of that in the curriculum, not because I'm trying to discriminate against it, but because I just wouldn't know what to say. And
Right.
Whereas I might look at this other stack of stuff and be like, I know so much stuff about that. Like, and that gets my juices going, and like I would just talk about that. And I think there's enough room in the choral pie for teachers who have their different passions to, somebody's got to be the one who's passionate about the a cappella pop stuff. Somebody's got to be passionate about the show choir stuff. Somebody's got to be passionate about all these different subgenres we have in choral music. So keep it up, keep doing it.
I appreciate it.
And I think
I love it.
There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. So I'll start wrapping this up a little bit, maybe kind of expanding this little brain session, this meeting of the minds a little bit, like I said earlier, where I take your terminology that you're using to describe these composers and your way of categorizing them, and then my brain wants to start expanding that to as many different areas of music and as many different cultures of music as I possibly can, to see if for me, it's about finding really good definitions, right? So I had asked you this one, and I want to put it in the podcast also. I asked you at the convention, Ola Yelo, Kim Arneson, are they writing white music, or are they writing Norwegian music, or are they writing choral music?
There is no one right answer. There's not one right answer. The same way that three theorists can look at the same progression and decide that, this chord is a minor chord with an added six, or it's a half diminished. People can look at, or they can say it's not even a functional chord. It's just getting us from one chord to the next.
Mm-hmm.
That is an interesting topic. I honestly don't know, because Yelo wrote the piece Tundra, inspired by the cold in Norway.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But he wrote it when he was in the States. He wrote it for American choirs, if I remember correctly, for American women's choirs. But he was born there, but he lives here. But it was about there. So what is it? When we talk about like the Romantic era, when you think of music history, we start talking about exoticism.
Mm-hmm.
We talk about people writing about, cultures that are beyond them and that kind of stuff. But because of technology and the fact that we are able to just like jet set across the world, folks can move. Eric Whitaker moving over to England, or or Yelo and Arneson, being able to write for so many folks. I say what I said before. If you can give me a few reasons to justify it, I'll believe quite a few things, as long as you have some proven facts. I am a fact guy, which is the reason why, if I see something on Facebook that looks a little too good to be true, I'll probably go to Snopes first to figure out if it actually is too good to be true. I'm not just going to forward, any random message that gets sent to my inbox. So back to Arneson and Yelo. I think that they are writing choral music, that they are writing American music, and they're writing Norwegian music.
That's a very politically correct answer. I almost agree with that. I would say I would hesitate to say that they're writing Norwegian music, only because there already is idiomatic Norwegian music, and it sounds nothing like their music.
But does Norwegian music have to be idiomatic?
No, I just mean like there is music that is unique. It's going to be the folk and indigenous music, of that part of the world. And there is even choral arrangements. There are choral arrangements of, say, even Norwegian folk songs and that kind of thing. And those two composers aren't really living in that world. Like they're doing other things, and
Mm-hmm.
so I would hesitate to call it Norwegian. I wouldn't like to call it white music, because that isn't a good term, because in my mind I think it's reductionist.
Yeah.
And mostly reductionist, because what does that tell us about the music itself? It doesn't tell us anything.
Yeah.
It tells us about the skin color of the person, but it doesn't tell us about the music. So I don't see those as good music terms. I so I like saying that they write choral music, because their music sounds more like, heck, Nathaniel Dett's music than it would sound like Norwegian folk songs.
Yeah. There are times when it is necessary for us to give things a label. And there are other times I feel that it's, um, so if you are honestly trying to represent different cultures and you want to represent Norway, then you may just have to say, you know what, for this time, I'm just not going to do Arneson or Yellow. And I'm going to find somebody else that they could be writing just straight up classical music that doesn't really have any Norwegian idiomatic influence. But just because they're somebody different, they're representing Norway. And that's totally fine. Um, I understand why, I'm not saying that this is what you're trying to do, but I understand why there are times and there are people who feel that, everything has to have a label. We have to say, we have to have a label in this bathroom, and you have to get a label to say you can only use this one type of bathroom and that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
When especially, like I was at the body shop the other day, the men's restroom was closed, and me, I have no problems going into a women's restroom if it's just one toilet. I'm like, I'll just go in there. I used to do it at work all the time, because, well, one of my trainers said you just do that, because there's only one difference between those two bathrooms when you have one person, and I'm not going to tell what the difference is, but just go in and use it. Like, it's fine. But there are times when labels are necessary.
Right.
So if you specifically want to highlight a certain group, like for me, the very first concert I did with all collegiate choir here was a celebration of Black composers. Why did I do it? One, because I could. Two, because I love this music. And three, because I wanted to make sure that my students and the audience knew you don't have to do a celebration of Black composers only in the month of February. Our concert was in October,
Mm-hmm.
and it went very well. It went well. I can honestly say that most of the music that I did last year and most of the music that I have planned for this next year, not a ton of Black composers, because while that's what I love, I also love Poulenc. I also love Debussy. I love Elaine Hagenberg. I'm so looking forward to doing Oh Love with the University Chorale. I'm looking forward to that. But we are going to do 3 psalm settings by Ulysses Kay and chamber singers. We are going to do a piece by Jarrell Gray, Brittany Boykin, because I want to make sure I represent my younger composers, the ones who are like under 40. So I have those 2 pieces. I have Crucifixion by Hailstory, because that piece is just fire. It is fire. And it's going to take some work. So that's what we're going to start working on in November and not performing until March.
Right.
But
so here,
but yeah.
here let me jump in. Let me jump in here and say that I think we agree in the sense that, like, when you said we don't have to label everything, and then sometimes they're necessary. I agree. For me, a label, in order to label something, it has to meet some standards that I've set for myself. It's got to be accurate. It's got to be specific, and it's got to be non-derogatory.
Okay.
Right. So my problem with labeling things by skin color is that frequently that is used as a derogatory.
Yeah.
And that goes on like almost any skin color in the world, depending on where you are and who's talking.
Yeah.
That can be used as a derogatory. So to me, the only reason to ever use skin color as a label would be, let's say, hey, that guy over there is my friend, and there's 5 guys standing over there, and one of them's Black, and you have to describe which one it is. right?
Yeah.
Oh, it's the black guy. Yeah, he's my friend.
Yeah.
Well, okay, well that's specific. It's accurate.
Mhm.
It's not derogatory. But so with the labeling of music, my issue is not that it's derogatory, but it's that it's not specific enough. Which is why I pushed back and said, aren't you really talking about Black American music? Because
Yeah.
it got to be more specific, and that's kind of what I'm really the way my brain wants to kind of process all of this terminology is to whittle it down to, are we all talking about the same thing?
Yeah.
That's basically.
One thing that I said at every presentation pretty much is, I'm a black man. I'm a proud black man. I have no problem with you calling me a black man as long as you don't say that black man. As long
Right.
as it's not derogatory.
Right.
And that kind of stuff. I remember I worked at Cracker Barrel for 13 years, and more times than not, clientele did not look like me and that kind of stuff. Sometimes we'd have more employees that did. Um, and there was one instance where a woman came and she was trying to find her server. And she was like, "Oh yeah, it's this person." And we had a black girl and a white girl. And I was like, "Well, you remember what she looked like?" She was like, "Well," I said, "Was she black or was she white?" She's like, "Well, she's African American." And her daughter was like, "Mom, you can just say black." I said, "Yes, I said it. You can just say it right now. It's like it's totally fine," and that kind of stuff. You know, for me, when I talk about the race of a person, I talk about it with everybody.
Hmm.
I don't only talk about it when it's this. And what I found is that a lot of my white friends, most of them, pretty much only reference race if it's something other than themselves. I have no problem just saying, and sometimes I joke about it. They'd be like, "Yeah, so which one of your students?" I'm like, "Yeah, well, one of the white students. I teach in Nebraska, so pretty much all of them are white." I do it as a joke, just to make sure people understand that I can make reference to somebody as being white just as easily as I can with black. And so, I mean, I can do it with music as well. I typically don't, just because I don't know if there's really a reason.
But
Um,
I have a funny story that goes right off of what you just said. In fact, uh, it just happened not too long ago, also, where you mentioned that you refer to yourself, you think of yourself as a black person. You're proud to be a black person. That's awesome. But then a lot of your white friends don't refer to themselves as that, right? They don't say
mm,
I'm a white person, and that was what I was thinking too. Like I don't have as part of my identity when I look in the mirror, I'm a proud white man. Like I don't use the term in my own inner dialogue at all ever. Like and most white people I know don't. And I was listening to a sociologist slash psychologist on a podcast, and I'm not going to be able to say who it was because I listen to so many podcasts I can't remember who it was.
I
But a
understand.
pretty reputable, was talking about that very thing, and it comes down to, from a psychological standpoint, it comes down to the fact that here in the United States, it's as simple as we are in the majority. So when you look around and almost everyone you see looks like you don't, from a psychological perspective, you don't feel the need to distinguish yourself from
Right.
other people. And he said, but if, and this experiment was done by some of his researchers, take 100 white people to Beijing and drop them off in downtown Beijing and let them walk around on their own. And it does not take very long for them to notice every other white person that they see
Yep.
in that sea of faces that doesn't look like them, because what they're doing is that all of a sudden they are in the minority, so they look around for similarities. And I was listening to that episode, and then not too long after that, and I was finding that fascinating because I'm 40 years old and I had never thought of it that way.
Hmm.
Like I just never thought of it. And then I go to my sister's birthday party, and my sister has about 5 or 6 black friends that work at her company that came over to my dad's house for her birthday party. And not a single one of, like, okay, so there was one group of black guys and then another group of black guys came. The two groups of guys did not know each other, right? But, and you probably know what happened when all 5 of them walked into the same room. Instantly, handshakes,
Yep.
high fives, hugs, right? And I'm sitting there watching that going, that's fascinating because white people don't do that.
Yeah. So
but then when I listened to that episode by that sociologist, I said, I bet white people in Beijing if would do that if we'd been there for 15 or 20
yeah,
years or so, we would probably like start greeting each other to single ourselves out, and because we're all human ultimately. I think that's my point.
yeah,
It's like but we're
yeah,
just in different situations.
yeah. I mean, like at ACDA conventions, that happens
Yeah,
with Black people.
yeah.
Um, I will say that there have definitely been more in the past like 2 years with the regional and national conventions. I've seen more Black conference attendees than I had in years past. But every Black person that I know that was going to them before that, they will tell you that at every conference, they are constantly looking to see how many other people look like them. Um, I had a I've had a couple conversations recently with some of my friends, and I kind of asked them, I kind of challenged them, and I've thought about putting it out on Facebook because I've seen this social experiment. I got tagged in it today. It said, "What was Can you remember what grade you were in when you had your first Black male teacher?" And one girl said that the first one she ever had was me as her TA, which was 2 years ago. I mean, I think, was a sophomore, maybe a junior,
Hmm.
and I was the first Black male teacher that she had had. Um, but I said to my friends, I was like, "Have you ever like actually been the minority in a situation?" And they thought about it and like, "No, I don't think I ever have." I was like, "Yeah, it probably would do you some good to
Hmm.
actually go and be the minority in a group." For me as a Black person, of course, the first thing I'm thinking is just go to a Black church.
Yep.
Even in Lincoln, Nebraska, we got like 3 or 4 of them. Like you could even go to one of those if you're, in town. Because I like it's very easy to tell. I mean, and one thing that I've said the last year, whenever I go somewhere, is in Nebraska, say if you ever forget who I am, all you gotta do is say that new Black guy that teaches at UNL. They'll know who it is because there's only one other Black person who teaches in the School of Music here. We have like 45 full-time faculty members. So it's very easy. When I look out, I mean, when I'm at church, when I'm in a faculty meeting and all that, in a concert, I can tell that I am one of very few. I never feel like I am less than or anything.
Hmm.
I'm like, I'm fine. I'm fine being here. And I don't feel like I need to have any more Black people. But it wasn't until December, early December, when my friend Ariel told me that he had met this woman who is in town, and the three of us got together for his birthday. And I had been in Nebraska for 4 months by that point. And it wasn't until then we had dinner. We were there for like 3 or 3.5 hours. I texted them all later, said, "Y'all have no idea how therapeutic that was for me just to be with Black people." It was just the three Black folks together. And it was just like, wow, like I hadn't thought about it. I didn't necessarily need it, but it just felt good. And so, sometimes for me, even in music, when I can go to a performance and I can say, "Oh, wow, they actually have, even if it's just one non idiomatic piece by a Black composer," I'm just like, I feel a little more at home now. Just because for me, since it's something that I promote, I readily identify with that. Again, I'm not trying to say that everybody has to have an non idiomatic piece on every concert that they do. If you choose to do that, you get a gold star from me. But if you don't, I'm not going to think anything less of you. I'm not going to think anything less. So yeah, I mean, I talk about this to educate folks because I mean, as you and I had said, I mean, you didn't really know about this, and there are so many people who said, "I've never." One, they never heard the term. Two, they hadn't thought about that, and there are a lot of people who will say, even in their 40s, "I've never sung an original piece that didn't have an idiomatic influence by a Black composer." I can't think of one.
Yeah, and I
There
think
may have been some that some folks just didn't know,
right, right.
and that kind of so
Yeah.
it would be interesting to go back, but that then also says that one, I guess it's kind of a good thing because then it just makes music just be music,
Hmm.
which is great. Um, but there is something that is empowering about just knowing who you are. It's like when you talked about some people being talking about like me talking about the fact that I am Black. You know, there are plenty of Black people who say they reference themselves that way because there is power in identity. and knowing your identity and owning it, especially when it was used in a derogatory sense for so many years.
Mm-hmm.
You can then take that back and say, I own it now and there's nothing wrong with it and that kind of stuff. There's something special about that. So,
Well, yeah, I mean, there are tons of terms. The term "gay" comes to mind
okay.
that were used as a derogatory for so long,
Yeah.
and then taken back and given power.
Yeah.
And so I think the all of the conversation that people like you are driving about this kind of music, um, is important, and I think that's the type of that kind of falls under the same subcategory. I'm not comparing the experiences at all. I'm just trying to, again, I'm thinking linguistically, like how do we use words, and we use words sometimes to categorize people in a hierarchy of, like, that's why I say I don't like labels that are derogatory, because they
Right.
they arrange people into a hierarchy. I only like labels when they describe something so that we can understand it, right? Like,
Yeah.
so that if you're saying a thing and I'm saying a thing, we're both talking about the same thing. So I think that we've accomplished that tonight, quite a bit. I understand more, and I think too, as I get older and I have more of these podcast conversations, I'm starting to understand more and more about just even the stories that you share and the stories that my guests share, about their own experiences in not only choral music but in life. I think about the story you just told about feeling therapeutically about hanging out just for a brief time with some other Black folks. That's
Yeah.
that's an experience that I can't ever understand, because I've never sat around ever in my life sat around with a group of white people and thought, you know, it's nice to just absorb that whiteness for a while, right? Like, that's not, I can't even wrap my mind around that. But again,
Yeah.
it comes from the fact that I don't have an experience of being, at least for a prolonged period of time, in a minority group.
Right.
Right. And so what I think makes me sad, and I don't want to end this podcast on a down note, but what makes me sad is I spend a lot of time on Twitter. That makes me sad. I need to stop, but I can't. Is that I on social media and other ways of communicating, we're frequently told that we just can't understand each other's lived experiences, and that, you just can't uh, connect in that way. And I think that factually that's true, in the sense that I can't ever live Marques's life, but Marques can't ever live
Right.
mine, and Marques can't live
Very true.
in another Black person's life either. Everybody
Right.
ultimately is an individual, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try.
Yeah.
That's how I see it. Like, I see it as like, I know I can't actually know what it feels like to walk in your shoes, but I should do as many mental gymnastics as I possibly can to understand what it might be like if I were in your situation, which is why I think I resonated with the example of drop 100 white people in downtown Beijing, because
Yeah.
then I immediately thought, oh my God, yes, I can see myself walking up to the white person in the bar and being like, hey,
Right.
I, like, where are you
Not knowing
from?
that you don't even know they're going to speak English though.
Right.
But it's just like one of the you're going to be. Yeah, I totally understand.
Right. I can see myself doing that. Whereas if I'm in my environment around where I live, where everybody, 70% of the people in my community are white, I can't picture myself doing that, until I kind of do the mental gymnastics of, like, putting myself in a different situation. And
Yeah.
I think that's really what my goal was with this episode too, was even from the music side of things. If people don't know about these composers, they might have to do some mental gymnastics to go learn.
Mhm.
Go figure it out. So, like I said at the beginning, if you could, as many resources as you could share with the audience,
Oh yeah.
put in the show notes. That's the beautiful thing
And
about.
they can look at these books that I have up here. I have all of my Black books up at the top.
That's
So that's what I
awesome.
mean. I'm reaching for that first, but yeah, I mean, I keep getting more. But yeah, I would love that. I have a challenge for you though.
Yeah.
So you tagged me in one Facebook post when you thought that. Well, you technically didn't tag me. You tagged Jocelyn. I still can't get over that. That was the best. That was like the best experience from ACDA outside of the AO. But um, yeah, I'm looking forward to in the next, 6 to 9 months. Looking forward to your experience being the minority in the group.
Yeah.
There are, I look forward to you. I mean, like you actually saying, okay, I'm going to make sure that this is an experience that I have. I want to see what that's like.
Well, yeah, and it's actually interesting. I think ultimately the feedback is coming from the reality is there are amongst, I think, white people in 2019 a fear to even talk about topics that involve racial issues at all for fear of saying the wrong thing.
Yeah.
And I think that doesn't get us down the road where we want to go. I think that holds us back, because ultimately we don't heal history's wounds without looking forward. And eventually, like the way I see it is, eventually we have to have as a goal where a conversation like ours, maybe it's 200 years from now, but that our conversation doesn't even matter because everybody's one human family.
Yeah.
And how do we get there? Well, we can't get there if we don't talk about it.
Yeah, it is very important for us to find people who are not going to be combative when we bring up these topics.
Mm-hmm.
Because I know some people that if you bring up a topic like this, they're going to make you feel like you are the worst piece of crap.
Mm-hmm.
Because you don't know who this person is or that group or this composer, all that kind of stuff. And I then would just say, don't talk to them anymore. And also don't think that all Black people or whatever group is like them.
Mm-hmm.
I know plenty of folks who look like me who can say, I'm willing to have a conversation about this. But also finding folks, I have quite a few friends who are white. They're like, they say they are unapologetically white, but they understand the privilege that they have. They understand that their experiences are different than mine. I think of people like Susan Kelly at Tennessee State, or Mark Boyle at Seton Hill University. I mean, I can have any type of race conversation with them. Reuben Burroughs in Maryland. Any kind of conversation about race with them. Alex Favaza in New Hampshire. He and I talk about race all the time. And it's great. And he's as white as they come. And he will admit that. There's nothing wrong with it. But we can just have conversations, and they have no problems hearing my perspective. But I also never try to make them feel bad for not understanding. So, I mean, if anybody wants to have a topic about race, or you want to have a conversation about Bach, I can talk about it either one.
That's awesome.
And that kind of stuff. So,
well, I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show and helping break the ice on all of these important topics. And this has been really fun, and I hope to do it again sometime.
Yeah, be great. I look forward to seeing you again.
All right. Thank you so much.
All right. Bye now.
Thank you for listening to the show all the way to the end. I hope that means that you enjoyed it and found it meaningful. If that is the case, please leave a rating and a comment in the podcast app that you're listening. If you're listening on YouTube, feel free to comment there as well. That's a great forum to have a conversation back and forth with topics. Of course, if you really liked the episode, it's awesome for you to share it on your social media, Facebook channel, Instagram, anywhere, Twitter, that you can spread the word about the show. These are all ways that help the show become more visible to other people that might benefit from the content. Of course, the content here is always free. One of the ways that we can help do that is by finding the affiliates that are on the show, so you can show them that you're listening and that you appreciate it by trying out some of their products and using the promo code. So if you head over to graphitepublishing.com, ryanmain.com, or sightreadingfactory.com, and check out those products and services and use that promo code. Help yourself out, help me out. That's excellent. If you are feeling particularly moved to support the mission of this show, there is a third and final option, which is to head over to patreon.com/Choralosophy and become a Choralosopher Insider for as little as $3 a month. There are patron-only episodes on there, as well as a t-shirt you can pick up. Some behind-the-scenes updates on the production of the show. A really fun way to support the show for about the cost of a coffee every month and help this show become revenue neutral, which is my goal. I would love for enough support to come in so that I am not paying out of pocket to make the show for the rest of my life. That would be very helpful. So any of those ways you can spread the word are Much appreciated, and we hope to see you next time on the Choralosophy Podcast.